listen-only mode.
Hello everyone and welcome to the webcast. My name is Christine Dursey. I'm the Executive Director of APA Ohio and Vice Chair of the New Urbanism Division, and I will be the moderator for today's webcast. Today, Friday, October 25th, we will hear the presentation, Parking Reform Made Easy, How to Make Smarter Parking Requirements. For technical help during today's webcast, type your questions in the chat box found in the webinar toolbar to the right of your screen, or call the 1-800 number shown. For content questions related to the presentation, type those in the question box also located in the webinar toolbar to the right of your screen. We will answer those at the end of the presentation during the Q&A. On your screen is a list of the sponsoring chapters and divisions. I'd like to thank all those participating sponsors for making these webcasts possible. Today's webcast is sponsored by the Transportation Planning Division. For more information on this division and how to become a member, visit planning.org/division/transportation. And to learn more about all the divisions, you can visit planning.org/divisions. On your screen is a list of upcoming webcasts. To register for these webcasts, visit utah-apa.org/webcasts. To log your CM credits for attending today's webcast, visit planning.org/CM, select today's date and today's webcast. This webcast is available for 1.5 CM credits. Like us on Facebook, Planning Webcast Series, to receive up-to-date information on the series sponsored by our chapters and divisions. We are recording today's webcast, and it will be available on our YouTube channel later today. Just search Planning Webcast on YouTube, and a PDF of the PowerPoint is also available upon request. Okay, next I'm going to open up a poll real quick so that our speaker can gauge the sector that his audience is. So if you could go ahead and take that real quick. I'm pulling it up now. There we go. All right, great. So while everyone is doing that, I'm going to go ahead and swing it over to Gabriela Juarez. She is the webcast coordinator for the Transportation Planning Division, and she's just going to speak briefly. Gabriela?
Hello. Thank you, Chris. I'm Gabriela Juarez. I'm the webinar coordinator, as Chris mentioned, for TPD. And we are super, super excited about this incredible subject and our amazing panelists who volunteered to do this, Dr. Richard Wilson, or Rick. And it's just an amazingly fantastic book that's Shupisa approved, which we just adore because Raul Shupisa, at some point has all been part of his expansive world of parking research. So we're super excited about this really fantastic presentation that we have today, and I'm super grateful and very, very grateful to Rick Wilson for his willingness to do this and also for just doing what he does so well. We don't have enough opportunities to thank the great people that we have as colleagues, and I just want to express how incredibly grateful we are to him and all his good work. If you are out there and are not going to be intimidated by the wonderment that you're about to see, please contact me for ideas to do a new webinar. Even if you don't think it's a great idea, I will, and I'm going to help you make it better. So please don't be shy and send me an email about doing something in the next coming year. And if you aren't a TPD member, I hope that this entices you to also become a division member. So with that, I'm going to have Chris go ahead and introduce our amazing panel. Thank you.
Thanks, Gabriela. Okay, Richard Wilson is our speaker today, and he is a professor and chair in the Department of Urban and Regional Planning at California State Polytechnic University, Pomona. He previously served 2 terms as chair of the Department of Urban and Regional Planning and as interim dean of the College of Environmental Design. Dr. Wilson's research addresses parking policy, climate change planning, land use transportation relationships, travel demand management, and transit-oriented development. His book, Parking Reform Made Easy, was published by Island Press in June 2013. His research has also appeared in the Journal of the American Planning Association, Transportation, Regional Science and Urban Economics, Transportation Research, and others. Dr. Wilson consults with regional and local agencies such as the Bay Area Rapid Transit District, local cities, and developers of urban infill projects. Prior to his academic career, he was a transportation planner for the City of Los Angeles Community Redevelopment Agency. Dr. Wilson holds a Ph.D. in urban planning from the University of California, Los Angeles, a master's in planning from the University of Southern California, a Bachelor's of Environmental Studies from the University of Waterloo, and is a Fellow of the American Institute of Certified Planners. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Richard, and I'm going to go ahead and close up this poll. Richard, are you able to see the results?
Not yet.
Okay, so I'll just go ahead and read them to you. I'm going to close it now, but it looks like of all of those that are on today, 67% are public sector planning, and 26% are private sector consulting. And then it looks like 3% public sector, public works engineering, 3% nonprofit, and 1% private sector developer. So I'm going to go ahead and close this poll now. Thanks everyone for doing that, just so that Richard can gauge who his audience is. Okay. Perfect. And now, Richard, I'm just going to go ahead and change the controls over to you so we can get this started. Perfect.
All right. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining this webinar. It's very exciting for me to be able to talk to you about parking reform. The title of the book that I wrote this last year is called Parking Reform Made Easy. And in presenting it to people, I get a little pushback on the title because everyone knows that parking reform is not that easy, and if it was easy, we would have made revisions to our zoning codes by now. So it was too long, but an alternative title could have been Parking Reform Made as Easy as Possible Under the Circumstances. What I'd like to do is walk you through the kind of the problem, and in some dimensions you may already know about, others might be new to you, and then tell you about a process that you can use in your local cities or that the development community can use to figure out what amount of parking is the right amount of parking for zoning codes. So let's start in the air. This is in my neighborhood of Cal Poly Pomona. This is showing on the right the Ontario Mills Shopping Mall, typical suburban land use pattern, and we're near the I-10 and I-15 freeways in Southern California. You can't really see the parking utilization very well, but the parking around the mall is probably about a third full at the moment this image was taken. The other thing I'd like to point out is my cursor is pointing to a white roof on the left, and that's the Citizens Bank Arena, a really nice arena the City of Ontario has built. And of course it has its own parking lot around it, and that parking is completely empty because there's no event at the time the image was taken. This kind of environment is one where parking requirements treat each site as an island, a self-sufficient island that should provide as much parking as it will ever need at its peak period time. And when you have those parking islands, you end up with a land use pattern that looks like this. You know, a logical strategy here would have been to put the arena within walking distance of the mall so that shared parking could be used. In the peak shopping season, after the day after Thanksgiving, perhaps the arena's parking could be used by people going to the mall, and other times when the arena's having an event, they could use the shopping mall parking. The environment on the ground with this type of layout is not very friendly to pedestrians, bicycles. It's challenging to serve with transit because buildings are set back. And I think this is, the normal critique of parking requirements, that in suburban areas they require an oversupply of parking for most times because of the peak utilization, the rates based on the peak utilization, and because of a lack of shared parking. But I don't want to just pick on suburban areas. By the way, here's what it looks like on the ground, and I always check for oil spots in parking spaces because the ones that are seldom used often look as pristine and clean as these. But to not just pick on the suburban areas, here's another image. This is the city of South Pasadena, which is north of downtown Los Angeles. It's a very nice, walkable community with fine-grained land use patterns. You can see that parking is present, but it's not dominating the street, so you have a good street edge. So a lot of good things are going on here. And what could possibly be the problem with parking requirements? Well, in this case, the parking requirements are a block to business creation and revitalization. I know this particularly because a property owner lent me a store for a pop-up art gallery for 3 months. And I watched as she tried to attract a permanent tenant to this space. She decided that the most appropriate use is a lunchtime type restaurant that would complement the other uses on the block. But the city's parking requirement for such a restaurant was 10 spaces per 1,000 square feet. That was impossible to fulfill in these largely historic properties where the parking areas are relatively fixed. So in this case, the parking requirement was affecting the retail mix on this block and diminishing investment in business creation. And to some extent, sometimes city officials don't even know this because prospective business owners are discouraged even before they approach the city for a building permit or a business license. In this case, the city is actually this week changing their parking requirements to correct this, but this is often an impact of parking requirements we don't think as much about. The other example that I'm thinking more about actually since I read the book was places like this environment. This is Huntington Park, a lower income community southeast of downtown Los Angeles. And there you have a community that was built on probably the suburban single-family model, but and is largely built out, but where the density of people per unit and per acre is high. So there's a lot of squeeze on parking. There's more cars per household than normal, and so this is an area where there's different kind of parking challenges, and the policy question is how should those cities address those parking challenges. So you've probably heard the critique of minimum parking requirements, and this is a diagram showing some of the problems associated with conditions where the minimum is greater than the actual use of parking. So if we follow this circle around, we see that excessively high minimum parking requirements have site impacts relating to the auto by lowering density and creating more automobile-oriented site designs, which kind of reinforce automobile use. They have site impacts that make non-automobile access more challenging. You have a difficult environment for walking, biking, and transit service, so that discourages those modes. If codes require more parking than is actually used, there's unlikely to be a price for parking, and therefore parking is free, which is an incentive to park. And when we have these conditions in place, we develop market norms where developers, lenders, appraisers, tenants all have expectations of certain amounts of parking. I was doing a study years ago of office parking, and I interviewed architects and developers and lenders, and I asked them how much parking is needed in a suburban office building, and they said 4 spaces per 1,000. And I said, how do you know? And they said, well, that's the golden rule. I said, where did the golden rule come from? No one could tell me. So there was a kind of idea of good practice that actually wasn't very well related to actual parking demand. Development to be a parking island, then there's no reason to do shared parking. There's no incentive. It's not worth the trouble. So all these factors conspire to produce environments that most planners and communities say aren't what they want. They aren't walkable. They aren't mixed use. They have a lot of land devoted to parking with all the environmental impacts entailed in that. So my central contention is that parking is policy. It's one of the most important policy decisions that your jurisdiction can make. I think in the past we've thought of parking as a kind of standard technical requirement that might come from a standards book, that it's an analytical choice of getting the right amount rather than a significant policy choice. So in my work, I see that parking is at the center of a group of goals and objectives that planners and communities care about. Transportation goals relating to alternative modes. Certainly design goals related to creating active streets, reducing sprawl. Economic development goals related to business creation and the cost for businesses, as well as sustainability goals related to air pollution, greenhouse gas emissions. I include social equity here in terms of how those with cars and those without cars are accommodated in the urban environment, and lately issues related to physical activity. So I try to put parking at the center of the policy questions that communities face. So I want to put parking requirements in their place. And what I mean by that is the following. Parking requirements are the tail that wags the dog in many cases. And what I mean by that is the ultimate goal of our transportation system is provide accessibility so people can get to jobs, shopping, recreation, all sorts of things that they want to do. And so as we go down this chart from the top to the bottom, there are different methods of providing accessibility. We can affect it with land use planning. If we have higher densities or mixed use development, we can affect it by telecommunication substitution, teleconferencing like we're doing today, or certainly physical. And in that realm, the private vehicle is only one of different ways of accomplishing that. And vehicle parking is one part of that system. And as we follow down, parking issues can be addressed usually with supply or demand management. And way down at the bottom are parking requirements, only one way of making sure that parking supply is available. So we need to think of parking requirements in their appropriate place in serving our transportation goals. And I'm not on a campaign against parking so much as on a campaign to promote clear thinking about whether parking requirements support community goals. So we can look at this issue and ask, are parking requirements a habit that we've developed? Do we have parking requirements because they give us leverage to negotiate other public benefits? Are we addicted to parking requirements, or what? So there's a lot of reasons why things don't change with parking requirements, and I want to acknowledge them and not be naive about the process of making changes. I was at a meeting, City of Los Angeles is redoing their code comprehensively, and someone in the meeting said, there's a lot of people with a stake in the current broken system who are not going to give that up very easily. And I think we could look at, in some cases, parking requirements being a broken system. But it's a broken system that serves people in certain ways. So these are kind of the issues we're going to have to just to be made. Certainly, individuals thinking of their own self-interest would like there to be lots of parking at a low price right where they want, where their destination is. Planners, I think, use parking requirements to negotiate other public benefits, such as affordable housing. Parking requirements are a clearly legal form of requirement to place on developers, and some other kinds of access requirements might be more difficult to justify. Sometimes the Public Works Department likes the high parking requirements because it basically reduces the need to manage and enforce on-street parking. Developers who bear higher costs because of parking requirements often don't complain as much as I would expect, but in some ways it takes them off the hook from figuring out from a market standpoint how much parking is actually appropriate. And finally, community groups that want to slow down or stop development often use parking impacts and parking overspill as leverage. So these are some of the issues that come up when one tries to change parking requirements. And later in the presentation, I'll discuss some ideas of how to address those issues. But if we are addicted to parking requirements, then perhaps we need a 12-step program. So as I was designing the methodology for changing parking requirements, I think at one point I had 11 steps, so I said, let's just go for it and have 12. So here is a process, and this tended to help planners and others develop a justification for reforming parking requirements that has the rationale and appropriate policy backing. I think, you know, my studies in the past have shown that sometimes planners use averages out of the Institute of Transportation Engineers Parking Generation Handbook as a basis, which has national data on parking occupancy. The APA publishes a compendium of parking requirements in other cities, and often planners call the city next door, perhaps look at the APA publication, and basically adopt their neighbor's parking requirements. And there's problems with those approaches. The ITE Parking Generation Handbook reports on data primarily from suburban areas where parking is free, transit isn't that great. So if we just use those numbers, we're replicating a set of conditions that may not be what we want locally. When we copy our neighbor's parking requirement, you know, precedent is important, but if they're wrong, then we're just replicating the wrong number. So I'm hoping that this method can help you develop reforms to parking requirement that fit community goals. I would also note that this is a little different from my colleague Don Shoup's prescription. Don Shoup's book, great book, The High Cost of Free Parking, suggests that cities should deregulate minimum parking requirements and price on-street parking appropriately and return some parking revenues to the local community. I like that idea, and that is in fact what's happening in the core areas of major cities. I was just at the Railvolution conference in Seattle, and Seattle has deregulated parking in parts of the city. So has Portland. Los Angeles' adaptive reuse ordinance has done the same thing. So all over the country, in core areas with lots of density, mixed use, and transit, communities are doing exactly what Don proposes. My motivation in preparing this methodology is most cities I dealt with are not ready to get rid of minimum parking requirements. At some point in the future they may, but politically the support isn't there for such a large change. So this method could lead to a community deciding to lower its minimum parking requirements, or it could lead to a decision that we're going to eliminate them, but it doesn't presuppose the outcome. What I'd like to do is to talk to you briefly about the 12 steps here. I'll give you an overview and then we'll go briefly one by one so you can see what I'm talking about in each step. The general approach here is 4 parts. One is that we need good data on parking utilization. And local data is desirable, not just national data. The second concept is that parking requirements should be forward-looking. All of our community plans, regional transportation plans are looking 20 or 30 years into the future, and so should parking requirements. Steps 3 through 9 are a set of adjustment procedures to say concerning local conditions and local policy priorities, things like if we're going to have parking pricing, how will that affect parking use? How will our plans for transit improvement affect parking, and so on. And finally, the last 2 steps are concerning if you have a certain parking requirement, how can we make sure that we're not wasting land or building area through parking size requirements that are excessive. So let's proceed through these steps. The first step is about data, as I mentioned. And I think the general perception is it's hard and expensive to get local parking data. The reason it's important is parking demand varies across community conditions and even within land use categories. For example, the difference between an office building that's a headquarters and an office building that contains mortgage processing facilities, those buildings have much different employee densities and much different parking demand patterns. So some of the ways to get this data at low cost are, one, to use photo interpretation. So you see here an image of an office building. Google Earth does not tell you exactly what time the image was taken, but you do know that it's a weekday, and you can look at the patterns of shadows to indicate whether you're close to the noon period in the day. In this case, the shadows are small, so this is roughly midday. And you can actually just count from air photos. It's a no-cost way of determining, looking at many sites in your community and figuring out parking utilization. Obviously, it only works when you have surface parking. Of course, if you have parking structures and the top floor is empty, that is also an indication of what's going on. The other no-cost data source is census data, and this is primarily for a residential parking use. You can look up using American Fact Finder now that it's working again, that the federal government is back in action. You can look up the average household vehicle availability for rental households and ownership households, and that gives you some data. You can look at that at the tract level to see how that varies across your community, and I think you'll find significant variation. You can also look at travel mode split share in the community to get some sense of parking demand at office sites, but you have to combine that with some information on employee density in the buildings. The final method is counts, which can be challenging to get site access, but there's a lot of great work being done across the country on counts. In King County, in the Seattle area, there's been a major study that did parking utilization counts in multifamily residential buildings. In San Francisco, a couple of efforts are underway. So you may be able to use that information as well. Finally, when we come to the question of the ITE trip generation rates, I'm sorry, ITE parking generation rates, those data have been criticized because they represent average conditions, but there are a lot of warnings in the beginning of that report that you need to look carefully at applicability of that data for your community. So you may want to, I don't rule out the use of that source, it just has to be carefully interpreted. So with this step one, you have a better sense of the level of parking use in the community. Now I do want to say that that doesn't mean that's what the parking requirement should be, right? Because that existing pattern of use may reflect conditions of free parking, a lack of transit access, separated land use, conditions that the community is moving away from. So it's the place to start, but it doesn't tell you what the parking requirement should be. The next step is considering the future, and this is a point I think is very important. I think we're in the midst of a technologically driven sea change in vehicle ownership and use. When you look at high-density areas, you can see that there's a big change in the use of alternatives to taxis, the use of car-to-go programs, Zipcar, and so on. So I think we're in a period of significant change in terms of vehicle ownership. And we should look at that. And the question is, does the parking requirement anticipate those changes? And so I developed in the book a list of possible trends that might affect parking demand in the future, and most of them suggest declining rates of demand per unit of development. An example would be increased, denser mixed-use development. Another example is the changes we see among young people. The rate of 16-year-olds getting driver's license is declining. And so these are things we should consider. Now, the City Council might say, yes, but we want to get the parking right for opening day, not 20 years down the road. Won't we have a spillover problem if we adopt a lower requirement? And my answer to that are two things. One, on-street parking management to deal with the issue of spillover. And two, temporary shared parking arrangements with other uses. So there are some ways of addressing it if there's a sensitivity to the project being undersupplied in opening day. Step 3 is what seems like an arcane question, but it's an important one, and that is, should we base a parking requirement on the average level of parking use that we measure in our studies, or should it be based on a percentile value? In the past, the practice has been to base it on a higher than average percentile value, like the 85th percentile value we measure, which means that we're requiring most projects to oversupply parking for the smaller percentage of projects that have higher demand. So this is a big policy question. I generally use the average level, but a community could say we're going to base it on a lower percentile, like 33%. And this chart uses the data from the ITE Parking Generation Handbook to show you how much a parking rate would differ if it was based on average or a percentile rate. So in this case, you first see the row with the adjustment factors, and then you see the calculated rate. Let's say this is office parking. So if we use the average rate, it would be 3 per thousand. If we use the 85th percentile, it would be 3.6, which is significantly higher. The next question to consider is the project's characteristics and the context for the land use. This chart is just an example from the U.S. American Community Survey of vehicles availability per occupied housing unit. It shows averages for owner-occupied and renter-occupied in the U.S., and then a series of counties in the New York area. And as you would expect, vehicle availability in New York is much lower than Queens, and Queens is lower than the U.S. So parking demand is varying across geography, and it varies between ownership and renter-occupied housing units. So this is where we might say we're working on parking requirements for an office uses in the community. If you know that those uses have a particular characteristic, such as tech businesses in Silicon Valley tend to have different office arrangements, higher employee density, so they might have a higher parking occupancy than a traditional headquarters office. So when we're developing parking requirements, we should think about both the particular nature of the uses in the community that are affected by these requirements and the context the community provides in terms of alternative transportation and so on. Step 5 is this question of pricing and its effect on parking demand. And there's 3 main tools. One is direct parking pricing, charging people for parking. In the case of in the case of both residential and office, the idea of unbundling, which is the parking charge is separate from the rent. So you rent an apartment, instead of getting 1 or 2 spaces for free, your rent is lower and the spaces are $50 a month, and you decide if you use them. And cash out is the concept of if an employer is spending $50 a month, let's say, leasing you parking, they offer you the money as an option instead of the parking. So all of these effects generally reduce parking demand. So if we're going to have parking pricing or unbundling in a community, then parking requirements should be adjusted downward to reflect their effects. And the big 0.3 is generally the kind of elasticity that we find for demand for parking with respect to price. What it means is if the price goes up 1%, the demand for parking would go down by 0.3%. Of course, parking requirements should be thinking about what's happening with other travel modes and the community's plans for transit, pedestrian improvements, bicycling, and car sharing. So all these factors, to the extent that they provide a competitive alternative mode, would affect parking requirements. Another question is how efficiently will the parking spaces we're requiring be used? This is one of a student in my, graduated from our program here at Cal Poly, Min Tai, and he's got a great job at the city of El Monte, and he has a space with his name on it, which is, I have never had that, so I'm a little bit jealous. But it's the worst thing you can do for parking efficiency, because when he's out in the field, that space is empty. The tradition in residential parking is multifamily parking is to assign spaces to units. So we need to think of the best, from an efficiency standpoint, the best approach is not to do that, to allow the whole pool of parking to be used as efficiently as possible. So in this case, if you're going to assign units, that means the parking will be less efficiently used and perhaps the parking requirement is higher. I would point out that the technology is helping us here with real-time parking information and guidance systems will allow us to much better use parking in the future. Another question that many communities are facing is, well, if we think a certain amount of parking is needed for this new development, must it be on site? Can some of it be off-site in a parking structure where there's a financial contribution towards a structure? And even in some communities have started to give credit for available on-street parking to meet the parking requirement. This image is from Old Town Pasadena, which used public parking structures as a tool with in lieu fees for generating very successful revitalization. In the back of the image is a container store built with zero parking because they are using the parking in the structure. And finally, we're at step 9, getting towards the end. I know the excitement's building. The question of internal shared parking. This is the concept that if you had a project with a cinema and an office uses, the cinema's demand is higher in the evening on weekdays and on weekends, and the office use demand peaks in the middle of the day on weekdays. So one parking space can serve both uses, and the result is there can be a reduction of parking requirements from what would be required if each use was separate to what should be required if there's shared parking. And the Urban Land Institute has the shared parking model, which I use all the time as one way of calculating that. Some jurisdictions have developed free models that are available. In particular, the Bay Area Metropolitan Transportation Commission has an online model that you can access and use for shared parking analysis. Now, step 10. We've gone through all these steps. We've come up with some data. We've adjusted it for the future. We've made all the adjustments to the parking rate, per 1,000 square feet or per unit. And we get to a prospective number. I contend that even then we're not done yet because we have to consider whether that parking requirement fits our community goals in the ones I've mentioned: transportation, land use, economic development, sustainability, and also consider administrative feasibility of certain parking requirement approaches. And it may well be that there's an iteration at this point where the development community says that parking requirement is going to make it difficult for us to build affordable housing or difficult for small business creation in our downtowns. And you might back through those steps and say, maybe we should do more with transit. Maybe we should do more with shared parking. And so it's an iterative process to see if the prospective parking requirement is really serving the community's goals. And so presumably you do that, you give it due consideration, then you've got a new parking requirement, which either might be lower or possibly higher than the existing rate, or this process could lead to a decision to say, in this part of the city or citywide, we're going to deregulate parking. We're not going to have a minimum parking requirement. 2 steps left. One is, what about space size? Many communities have had not so great experiences with compact spaces, but there's a lot of change in vehicle size going on. You can see in the image a smart car taking about half the length of a medium-sized SUV. So one approach that a lot of parking design and operations people recommend is not moving to a single smaller parking space size. The size you require might vary with the use. A use with a lot of turnover generally wants a slightly bigger size, and a use where cars are parked for a long period of time can get away with a somewhat smaller size. There's lots going on with vehicle guidance and self-parking vehicles that someday we may not need as much space between vehicles because you will actually get out of your vehicle before it parks itself in a garage or a lot. And finally, considering issues like tandem parking, valet parking for commercial uses, and mechanical parking on tight sites. I think tandem parking offers incredible efficiency gains in site design. People like to complain about it because it's less convenient to move a car to let the inside vehicle out. But it's worth considering, especially in terms of housing affordability. So this is a diagram that kind of runs through these steps. It shows you with real numbers. So this first one is, let's say we're looking at an office building in a suburban area, and we measure an average utilization in the community of 3.25 spaces per 1,000 square feet. We think about, in this case, the adjustment is upward because there is a trend for higher employee density in office buildings. Then the decision about whether to use a percentile or the average, we follow the average path and so the number stays the same. And then come the adjustments for future use and context conditions, pricing. In this case, it's assumed that all these things, there's no adjustment made because it's a traditional suburban setting. And we end up with a parking requirement of 3.06 spaces per 1,000 square feet. One thing that happens with parking requirements is we often take a number like that and round it up, like to 3.5 or something like that. I don't think that's a good idea because rounding up just is inefficient if it creates more spaces than really are needed. If we've done this process properly, there's no need to round up. Here's an example for suburban multifamily residential. Again, a measured rate of 1.65 cars per unit, a downward adjustment for future trends in shared car ownership and transit and so on, or broader trends like that. Again, the use of the average rate, so no adjustment there, and then adjustments for transit. And here we go with an upward adjustment. If spaces are going to be assigned, they're going to be less efficiently used, and that might affect your thinking about a parking requirement. So in this case, ends up with an on-site requirement of 1.7. With multifamily residential, you may want to have your parking requirements expressed per bedroom because that varies. So the book describes a way of taking that average and backing your way into per bedroom rates as well. So if you go through this process, there's a variety of places you might end up. I hope not the top row. That's where requirements are really more than is ever needed or used, which is wasteful. But the bottom row is the deregulation scenario. You don't have a minimum or a maximum. You might have requirements about the impacts of parking on the streetscape, on pedestrian activity, and so on, but you're saying to developers, it's on you to decide how much parking to build. Under that bottom approach, you've got to do on-street parking management to deal with any potential spillover parking issue. I think many communities come somewhere in the middle. In a suburban community, lowering the minimums more to the actual use level is not risky and provides tremendous efficiencies with land use and sprawl. Some cities say we're going to have a requirement, it's lower than the demand, but we're saying, developer, you must build this much, and it's up to you to decide whether to exceed that. Some communities have minimums and maximums. So you could end up at any of these places after going through the process. Now, parking requirements aren't just minimums. There's all sorts of other provisions. On the left I reviewed Philadelphia's new ordinance, Portland, and Vancouver, British Columbia, and then looked nationally for innovations in other parking requirements. On the left here we have measures that tame parking. It's ironic we require it and then we require it to be tamed. So things like requiring ground floor retail and parking structures, facade requirements, shading requirements, real-time information requirements and so on. And then on the right, more wrinkles on how we do the requirements to supply parking, such as parking maximums or tandem parking or car sharing parking or bike parking. And in the book there's an inventory of innovative practices across the country. Now it really is important to emphasize that parking requirement reform can't happen without considering parking management, because the usual objection to lowering parking requirements is concerns over spillover parking in commercial districts, into residential neighborhoods, and so on. So this should be part of the overall program, and some of the things that can be done are listed in this chart. For example, in commercial districts, using pricing, parking benefit districts to help address any overspill issue. In residential neighborhoods, using residential permit parking and parking benefit districts is a strategy. For other off-street parking, moving from free access to access control is a way to address issues, using pricing, using shared parking arrangements. So there's a lot of tools available. They're well tested and they work, and this is part of the set of answers you can develop for stakeholders when they say, if developer Y does not build as much parking as is needed, there's going to be impacts on the community. Now, back to my first point that parking reform isn't necessarily easy. How do we make this work? How do we work with the council, community members, developers, and so on to create an openness to reforming parking requirements? Well, you have meetings. This is a picture of a meeting in Laguna Beach where we were working on parking management strategies. But more seriously, I think the most successes I've had on this are when the parking requirement reform is linked to a broader community vision, where the council can say, we've adopted a new downtown plan or a specific plan. Here's what we're trying to achieve with economic development, walkability, and so on, and we can't have those old parking requirements and achieve this vision. So that's a key argument that I think is quite effective. For those people who want to be educated about parking requirement reform, certainly providing information on the cost of the status quo method of doing it, wasted land, livability results, fairness issues to non-drivers, and often, field trips to successful places are effective. In business districts, the stakeholders often say we need more parking, not less. But if you can take them to very successful places that have tight parking supplies and parking pricing and show them it's because of the place, not because of the easy parking that people come. I said educate for people who want to be educated. Other stakeholders are considering their own self-interest. And so there are ways to appeal to their self-interest. Letting the city manager know the tax revenue loss associated with excessive parking requirements. Returning revenue from on-street parking management to districts or neighborhoods. Engaging the development community in thinking of how they could deliver housing at a more affordable rate if parking requirements were reformed, and so on. And finally, there's a lot of allies in planning and small business, historic preservation, infill developers, affordable housing developers that may support you in advancing this case. So if Joni Mitchell and Bob Dylan wrote a song together, it would be entitled Paved Paradise Revisited. I think it's time to reform parking requirements. I hope the presentation has provided you with some ideas about how to do that, and I'm anxious to see your questions and comments. The book is available, and just by luck, this week Island Press is having a sale on all their books. They have great titles on planning and environmental issues, and so you can get the book for $20 at the website shown above, and my contact information is below.
Great, Richard, thank you. We do have questions coming in, so let's just get started right away. All right, the first question. Some developments I've reviewed want more parking than required by the city LDRs. If this can't be prevented through site plan negotiation, do you recommend adopting parking maximums in LDRs?
Yes, I'm a little bit different than most on the issue of parking maximums, but I might be wrong. So they're quite popular, and their role is to prevent development patterns that significantly undermine design and community development objectives. The reason I'm cautious about them is I think there's a fairly strong market penalty to developers who build too much parking. Certainly in the case of urban areas where the cost of structured parking is $20,000 or $30,000 a space, underground parking is $40 or $50. I think, but the case for maximums is stronger in suburban areas where a large development could really set a precedent and lay down a land use pattern and design that's not consistent with what the city wants. So I think in those cases a maximum may be appropriate. The other thing is if a developer does build more than the city thinks is appropriate, then immediately working with that developer and the next developer on shared parking arrangements so that that parking just isn't wasted if it's been overbuilt. And finally, if you have a community where developers have built a lot of parking in the past, one way of looking at it is a form of land banking, so that looking at planning approaches that will allow development on parking pads, this is over time, over 20 or 30 years, but to try and improve the urban design quality around the site and allow greater utilization of that land in the future. So I think it's case by case, but it is a useful tool to avoid a large-scale project that is inconsistent with community goals.
Okay, great. Our city's code restricts parking to only one row permitted in between the front building setback and the street right-of-way to reduce the sea of asphalt and reduce the amount of impervious surface. However, business owners are not in favor of this, as they want as much parking as possible in front of their building. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think the tradition from a business owner standpoint is to display your parking availability in front of your building. That's the way sites have traditionally been designed in suburban areas. I agree with requirements that push the building close to the street or limit the setback, if that's the community objective in terms of creating walkable sites, sites that are easier to serve with transit. Nothing is harder than walking, or not nothing, but it's not fun to walk from a transit stop through a sea of parking to a building that has a very big setback. So I think it's a good idea to do that. The development community is changing in terms of understanding the need for new design forms and walkability. So part of the effort could be to work with them, to work with the BIA or local developer groups to try and promote this more street-oriented vision of where parking would be behind the building, not in front of it.
Okay. The next question. A hurdle to shared parking is the fear of liability when you're dealing with private property. Do you have suggestions on how to get around this?
Yes, and I'll back up one step to talk about this shared parking issue. I think the way we've often treated parking requirements in the past of kind of setting the requirement and then forgetting. So set it and forget it. You don't really have to worry about it as a city. The developer provided it before they got the certificate of occupancy. You don't have to worry about shared parking. You don't have to worry about on-street parking management. The costs of that approach are high, and we need to move to a more managed approach. This more managed approach does mean more interaction between stakeholders, getting the city and private parking operators talking, getting private property owners talking about sharing parking, thinking about site design so it's possible to walk between sites. So those are all factors that need to go in the mix. On the issue of liability, in some states, the simple disclosure on a parking ticket that says the property owner isn't liable can work. In some cases, I think cities have bought liability policies that they could offer to the private parking owner to encourage them to open up their spaces. Another issue is if a property owner doesn't want people parking on the site, they might accept valet use of the site where the number of people coming in and out of a parking lot or structure is limited to the valet users. So there's lots of options there. One of the exciting ideas I recently heard about is City of San Clemente approached private property owners and simply leased their parking for certain times, for certain uses, on a short-term lease and offered it, and then that parking became public parking. For them, it cost some money, but compared to the cost of building the structure, it was very efficient. So it is an issue that needs to be addressed. The participants in sharing have to believe the system will work. So I think the city can play a role in trying to facilitate those conversations and come up with pilot projects that can be demonstrated and give folks more comfort with the idea.
Okay. What city does not require parking and does not provide public parking? What problems?
Examples?
I think that's, yeah, I think they're looking for examples.
Well, an example is, let's take Los Angeles. In its downtown, there's a lot of historic office buildings that were underutilized, and there was developer interest in converting them to housing. The code required parking for the change of use, and in a historic building it created a big challenge. So in that case, the City of LA adopted an adaptive reuse ordinance that said you only have to end up with as much parking as you started with. And it's not the only factor, but it really facilitated a growth in conversions of historic buildings to residential. Now, what happens to the people that move in there? Where do they park? And the answer in an urban area is they have a series of choices. They can park, if there's some on-site parking, at a higher price there. They can park next door. They can walk 2 blocks and get a better deal. So there is a parking market functioning where people make choices about whether to have a car or whether to use a car sharing program. And then if they have a car, how to trade off convenience versus distance. One other example is Portland, Oregon, which eliminated parking requirements in areas near transit stops. And so many multifamily and mixed-use projects have been built with 0 parking. The city did not provide public parking. And, you know, there are some, it's a pretty radical approach for a community. These are areas that aren't rail transit. It's just, it's good bus service is the criterion. So recently the pendulum swung back a little bit, and the city began to reimpose some parking requirements for large multifamily projects, but still exempt smaller ones. So in that case, community parking those who live in those units with zero parking, some of them have cars and they are parking in other arrangements off-street with another, making an arrangement with the property owner, or on-street, and this is where now Portland is beginning to develop more on-street parking management in neighborhoods to make sure that this policy doesn't flood the community with cars so local residents can't park anymore. So it all depends on context and density. In urban areas, this is a common practice. In suburban areas, it is not, and we're in a transition towards more use of shared parking resources in the future.
Great. How about some examples of jurisdictions that provide good examples of parking done well?
Well, I would say Portland is a good example. I've already mentioned them, but in terms of deciding the priority for parking use in core areas where the priority is for the shopper and the visitor, and the idea is to get the commuter on transit as much as possible. Other examples are in Santa Monica in California. They've been reducing parking requirements, but in concert with the arrival of a light rail line that will serve the community. So they're linking their transit plans to their parking requirements and parking management. And then worked with are moving from, in their downtowns, thinking that they have a parking shortage to using parking management to better use existing resources to get the employees off-street, to get turnover on the on-street spaces and so on. So there's a lot of movement across the country, and I think the examples of Philadelphia on the East Coast, Portland, Vancouver, British Columbia, San Francisco are good examples to look at.
Okay, great. Next question. What about cities putting a transportation fee on each on-site parking stall to encourage less parking and smarter land use?
So this is a tax or a fee for the, well, if it's a fee to build, a fee on the construction of a space that's used to fund alternative transportation, that makes sense to me. If it's a parking tax on parking use that funds alternative transportation, that makes sense to me as well. I mean, I think the issue is we need to look at all the transportation modes even-handedly. And in the past, our preoccupation has been accommodating those who arrive at a site by driving and parking. We need to think about ways of providing accessibility for bikes, pedestrians, and transit. And maybe someday we'll move away from parking requirements and towards an access fee that is used in some cases for parking. I would say shared parking, the best, and also can be used for alternative transportation. So I think that's a move in a positive direction. The only contradiction is if you have a high minimum and charge a fee, the developer is going to say, you're making me do this and then you're penalizing me for doing it. So I think thinking through how the parking requirement reform accompanies any kind of fee or tax is sensible.
Okay. This is an interesting question. If lenders, or I'm sorry, let's go to this one. Does demography influence parking demand? In one case I was involved in, a pharmacy developer wanted more parking, saying the elderly prefer to drive into a pharmacy with more parking. Thoughts?
Yes, I think demography influences parking demand, and the example I showed of, well, I didn't show an example, but a study I did in San Diego of parking demand in affordable housing. shows that residential parking demand is highly related to income, because income is related to vehicle ownership. The other aspect of demography is the age structure of the population, as the question pointed out. I mentioned that one dimension is seemingly less auto use among the younger people getting their licenses later and so on. And then, of course, we have the phenomenon of an aging population where driving and parking may be a preference. And all I'd say there is one response to that is to require parking, and the other is to explore alternative ways of accommodating the need to go to a drugstore, for example, such as delivery of prescriptions and so on, or local demand responsive shuttles. So it's true that many people would prefer to park at the front door of the drugstore. The question is, should the public sector require developers to provide enough parking to make that happen? They may make that decision on a market basis, and the city, if a city doesn't have maximums, they can do that. And I'd prefer to have developers assess parking demand in these questions, and as opposed to, and if really that's what the market wants, that's what will happen. But when we have high minimums, we don't know what the developer would do if really making this assessment on the basis of the market.
Okay, so this is interesting. So then on the other side, if you focus only on the current intended use, how do you handle parking requirements to take into account other future uses that may have different parking needs?
Yeah, that's a great question, because one of the concerns is intensification of the use of the site over time. So example would be a building permitted as a warehouse becomes more of an office use, or the users in a office building switch from a headquarters type building to an intensely used credit card processing facility. So those changes happen all the time, and I think what we've done in the past is set the requirements so they'll work for all the conceivable possibilities for higher intensity use of the facility or a change in use. What I would prefer in the long run is to not do that way, but focus on developing shared parking facilities that can handle the varying peaks and ebbs in parking demand by particular uses. Now, this doesn't work well in single site, separated sites, but thinking about designing those differently, thinking about creating some district parking resources is the answer to how we'll cope with individual uses that increase in intensity. Because when we make them all overbuild for possible increases, we end up with this wasteful use of land. Now, the mechanism for that could be an in lieu fee for part or all of the parking that constructs shared facilities that development would use. But I acknowledge that's a major concern because the city feels it doesn't have recourse perhaps as the use changes. But I think the answer is using on-street parking, using shared off-street parking as a resource to accommodate the ebb and flow and demand in particular uses.
Okay. Can you speak more about how to get buy-in from public works and code enforcement agencies and municipalities for on-street credits, design criteria for spaces, signage? What's the best approach?
Well, the first thing is, I think, led by the council or the city manager, the direction that departments should collaborate on these parking issues. And I think the impetus is, of course, the greater economic vitality and efficiency that can be gained by doing this. There is an example in my community, community in Eagle Rock in Los Angeles, where bars and restaurants were really what was happening in this district. Historic buildings couldn't provide the parking, and the community and the city developed an approach where they surveyed parking utilization on street. They had a process with the community, and they started giving credit for on-street parking toward code. I think Public Works and police in their enforcement roles, they don't see a problem with the status quo. So part of it is leadership in saying, of the city, here's the objective, and we'd like you to work together with these departments. Part of the problem with parking in the city is that the responsibilities are fragmented between police, public works, finance, planning, and so on. And so a larger city, one possibility is creating a parking role for someone who coordinates these issues to help get everybody on the same page. But a parking management and enforcement does bring in revenue, which may be of interest to certain stakeholders in the city structure.
Okay. Any suggestions to tailor your recommendations for more rural areas and historic downtowns?
Okay, two different cases. I think in the rural areas, the first ideas of, shared parking, pricing, mixed use may be less relevant to what's going on. So I think there the first priority would be questions about whether the requirements are wasting land. So the argument that we can use land more efficiently, whether that means preserving ecological areas or preserving farmland, that question of just wasting land, creating hardscape where there doesn't need to be, is a question. And I think in an area like that, one issue is requirements that say, okay, you've got to have the land for so much parking, but pave half of it and let's see how it goes. And if you don't have to pave the rest of it, it can be open space. Historic districts are where parking requirements can really impede the reuse of buildings. So in historic districts, the shared parking, public parking structure, on-street management strategy can really unlock interest in rehabbing and reusing buildings. So I think historic preservationists should be a major ally to parking reform in those areas. Often in those historic districts, there is plenty of total supply and it's never full. It's a question of better using the spaces that people don't know about or don't think in parking in, getting employees off the street and into off-street parking. So that can really be a boon to a revitalization activity.
All right. This is an interesting question. Can you say more about compact parking spaces and how a city can allow for or even mandate a portion of parking spaces to be compact?
Yeah. Well, one way of doing this is having your regular space size and then allowing a percentage of spaces to be smaller compact spaces. The challenge to that has been that drivers don't necessarily follow that suggestion, and so you get a large vehicle parked in a compact space, perhaps making the other space unusable. So that's been some of the concern. But I do think compact spaces can work in an environment where there can be some kind of enforcement to make sure it happens, because as you look at the space size of that smart car in the image that I showed, there's a possibility of much more cars per square foot than normally. What I'm hearing from the parking lot designers is this unispace idea where you might take your traditional space size and your compact space size and figure out the average and allow that new average square footage to be the parking space requirement. So I do think that in this area you want to coordinate and get advice from parking operators and parking lot designers who are dealing with this issue across many jurisdictions and have good ideas about what to do. But the trend is that, I think the trend is to reduce the width, length, and aisle requirements to avoid wasting land or building area.
Okay. Should there be regulations to bar any surface parking and require underground parking instead?
Some communities do that, and again, that relates to the plan and the design for the district. It's a huge cost difference between surface and underground, though, so that would require an assessment of the market in that area to determine whether that requirement could thwart development because the underground parking is simply too expensive to provide and you'll have no investment. So some more modest in-between positions are, requiring buildings to front the sidewalk, requiring, if there's the structured parking, that you have ground floor uses or the ability for those. So the step towards underground is a big one, and the land values have to be sufficiently high to make that pencil out.
Okay. Are there any suburban edge cities that have interesting new standards to look at?
Well, I showed you an example from the City of Ontario kind of criticizing their past practices in parking requirements, but Ontario has a new model colony developing the last bit of agricultural land in the city, and many cities like Ontario have adopted new parking requirements for areas like that, recognizing shared parking and looking at ways of reducing minimum requirements. Also, Sacramento, California might be one to look at and has been active in parking requirement reform.
Okay. Are there any studies on the financial impact of two adjacent commercial districts between free off-site parking lots and paid off-site garage parking?
Studies on the kind of economic success of those districts, I think. Well, one example that's very interesting to me is in the city of South Pasadena. There is the Old Pasadena district, which is often cited. I showed an image of a shared parking structure. Old Pasadena has on-street parking pricing, some of the revenue returns for community upkeep, and it has an in-lieu fee program to support the off-street structures. And so it has all those features and a high level of sales per 1,000 square feet. Literally within half a mile to the east is the Playhouse District in Pasadena, which is also retail commercial. It has free on-street parking, a much higher overall ratio of spaces per 1,000 square feet. Everyone complains there's not enough parking there, and their retail performance is lower. So I've seen examples where places that have pricing, parking management, and tight supplies outperforming places that have what we think we want, which is unpriced parking and lots of it. In the case of the Playhouse District, the reason why the lots of parking is not as evident is because there's not as much sharing of parking as there could be. So I don't think there's a performance penalty to adopting these parking management tools.
Have you ever come across a community that did not have any parking limitations at all, essentially letting the developer decide how much parking they need? What are some pros and cons to no minimum or maximum requirements?
Well, I mentioned the Portland example where they eliminated parking requirements for commercial and residential uses around transit. And if you look at a map of the city, it covers large swaths of the city around arterials. The pros and cons of this approach. The pro is you begin to move to a system where parking has to justify itself and its economics rather than being an automatic part of development regulation and building. And this will lead to a lower overall parking supply, parking pricing, and a leveling of the playing field between driving and the other modes. I think the con is the commitment of the city and the stakeholders to engage in parking management and dealing with residents and businesses who don't like the change from the status quo, who believe they're entitled to, for example, the on-street space in front of their house. So there is work to do in terms of gearing up for a new, more actively managed system, but I think the benefits are very significant.
Great. Okay, we're going to take one last question. Has reverse angle parking been considered as an acceptable response to replace perpendicular parking?
Reverse angle parking is being used in some communities. That's where you stop your car and back in at an angle rather than pull in at the angle. The advantages to it are improved safety for cyclists, especially because as the driver is pulling out of the space, they can see the cyclist. It is a bit of a different experience for the parker where the car has to stop and back into the reverse angle space. And compared to parallel parking, the issue is often with road diets and new urban design concepts in downtowns, angle parking is considered. If you have a lot of curb cuts along the block face, you don't always get that many additional spaces for the conversion from parallel to angle, but it's worth considering if it fits the right-of-way, the urban design concept, and there are starting to be more and more examples of communities doing it. So it's something to think about.
Great. Well, Dr. Richard Wilson, thank you very much for joining us today. This was great. We had a lot of people on the call today, so obviously this is an important topic. If we didn't get to your question, feel free to email. His information is on the screen now, and I am going to change over with just a few concluding comments. So for those still in attendance, I just want to remind you again to log your CM credits for attending today's webcast by visiting planning.org/CM. And the webcast is available for 1.5 CM credits. We are recording this webcast. There were some folks with more of those questions. It will be available on our YouTube channel. Just log on and search Planning Webcast. And if you would like a PDF of this, I'm fairly certain that Gabriella is going to have it posted on the transportation page, which is planning.org/divisions/transportation. Or you can just email me and I can send it to you. So this concludes today's session. Again, Dr. Richard Wilson, thank you for joining us, and thanks everyone for attending, and have a great weekend, everybody.